Thank you very much for that plug for the Writers Association of Northern Appalachia. I feel like it's tattooed somewhere on me. I'm always promoting the work we do, and of course, I forget to mention it in my brief bio. So, thanks, Marc and Pat, for inviting me here this evening, and thanks to City of Asylum for all the work that you do for writers. I normally write, as you could tell by my bio, nonfiction, but I'm working on a book called American Glass, which is a novel that takes place between 1946 and early 1950 in Moundsville, West Virginia. And if you've never heard of it, you probably have, because there's a penitentiary on one side and the largest conical Indian burial mound on the other. And that's where I grew up. That's my hometown. So the main character in this book, Jean, is based on my grandmother, Jean. And it's nice to muck around in somebody else's life rather than my own for a change. This is, I think, the second chapter. I don't know yet. But it's her birth story. And as all good heroes have, this is quite a birth. And this is based on fact, but of course it's fiction, so I can add a little sprinkle of something else. Jean Elizabeth Gould came into this world on December 21st, 1925. Her mother, Olive, labored for 12 hours on the longest night of the year to deliver 13.9 pounds of baby girl, the biggest newborn in Moundsville, West Virginia that year, maybe even that decade. Olive would tell Jean until the day she died how she had suffered in pain on a mattress on the living room floor in front of the coal stove while the winds howled outside. "You just wouldn't come out, Jean. But by God, when you did, I thought you'd like to rip me apart." Olive's mother, Ida, tended to Jean's birth with some assistance from neighbor ladies who were more nibby than helpful. After nearly 10 hours of raging contractions, they had to call Dr. Wood, who showed up with all of the newfangled tools of his trade, most of which seemed more like butcher's gear than birthing aids, Ida reckoned, as she peered into his overstuffed leather bag he sat on the mantel. She tended to him while he took off his overcoat and rolled his shirt sleeves up to his elbows, as he had done nearly a dozen times that day. He'd come from across town where Mary Beresford had just died of heart failure. He was weary and ready to go home for a too-late supper and what he hoped was a few hours' sleep. But when little George showed up at the Beresfords, out of breath and shivering from the blistering cold, he knew there would be none of his wife's beef stew or hot tea with a shot of rum that night. After stopping at a 2nd Street office for his birthing bag, Doc Wood arrived at 220 Poplar Avenue 10 hours after Olive's first painful contraction had hit. Ida told him in a hushed voice all that she had done to help the birth, which included putting a knife under the mattress to cut the pain, helping Olive into a squatting position to let gravity do its work, and rubbing her back with liniment when the pain liked to knock her out. Fully briefed, Doc Wood looked into the 21-year-old's tired eyes and frowned. "Olive, this baby is a big one, and I don't think it's going to come out without some help." Olive groaned and collapsed back into the soaked bed linens. "I just don't know if I can keep going," she whispered hoarsely, more to herself than to her doctor. Doc Wood crouched in front of her spread-wide thighs, shoving the first 2 fingers on his right hand deep into her vagina, feeling for the width of her cervical opening and probing for the baby's crown. After only a few moments, he withdrew his fingers and stood up slowly, wiping their sticky mess on the front of his gabardine slacks. Ida searched his face for understanding, but struggled to read it clearly in the dark front room, lit now with only a lantern, pushing the darkness into the corners. In between contractions, Olive would fall back to her pillow exhausted and listen to the wind howl through the eaves of the house her dad had built with his own 2 hands during the boom of 1900. "Am I going to be all right, Doc?" she asked breathlessly after another round of crushing pain gripped her abdomen and spread throughout her back and thighs. "Oh, sure, Olive. I have something right here that will get that baby out slicker than snot on a doorknob," he chuckled, attempting to conceal his anxiety. While he had used the forceps a few times in the past year or so, he felt less sure that he could handle a baby the size Olive was trying to birth. Judging by the enormous mound of her belly flesh, he knew the baby had to be more than 10 pounds. He also knew that if he gripped its head too tightly or held on for too long, that the consequences would be dire for both the mother and the baby. He had been warned by his colleague in Wheeling of what could happen: misshapen skull, hemorrhaging mother, death. And yet he knew that without assistance, Olive would not be able to birth this baby on her own. Not long after the forceps emerged from his bag, they were jutting out of the top of a stock pot of boiling water on Ida's kitchen stove. The metal glinted in the glow of gaslight as Doc Wood carried them by the handle with a clean dishcloth back into the living room where Olive's screams had reached what he hoped was a crescendo. He got down on his knees, an action that had recently become more of an agonizing feat in his 6th decade, and told Olive to push. She said she couldn't. Ida got into the muck-covered bed behind her daughter and lifted her into a half-sitting position, letting her recline slightly into her lap. "Come on, Olive, you've got to get this baby out." Olive pushed as hard as her exhausted body would allow, and it was enough for Doc Wood to slide the forceps into her birth canal and gently clamp them around the baby's head. "I got it, Olive. Now give me one more good push and you'll meet your baby. Come on." She took a ragged breath, gritted her teeth, and pushed as hard as she could. She screamed as the baby's head, then shoulders, breached the bounds of her cervix. Doc stopped pulling, and after a few careful snips of Olive's perineum, Jean slowly began to appear, her eyes as big and black as one of Ida's cast iron skillets. By the time Jean had fully arrived into this world at 11:21 p.m., the winds had quieted, and the more than 5 inches of snow that had fallen throughout her labor lay crisp and glittery in the moonlight. When Doc Wood walked back out into the bitter cold, dawn was starting to break, and his exhausted body felt every razor cut. In his 40 years of practice, he had never seen a newborn so big or so alert. This one, he thought, was ready to take on the world. All the menfolk living at 220 Poplar Avenue had stayed huddled in the kitchen throughout those agonizing hours, afraid to gaze upon the writhing Olive, half-dressed and coated in sweat. But unlike most births at that time, no anxious father huddled at the neighbor's house drinking rock gut whiskey and smoking cigars. Jean's father was nowhere to be found, and Olive intended on keeping it that way. Even after her parents threatened to exile her to the streets, she refused to give up his identity, saying only that he was from New York and he didn't want her or the baby she was carrying. Yet despite the scandal of illegitimacy, or maybe as a response to it, Jean grew up feisty and outspoken. She feared little, including what other people thought of her. Her grandfather had died shortly before her 5th birthday, so she was raised in a house ran by women, and neither her grandmother nor her mother took shit from anybody. Even after her mother married Willis Ballard when Jean was 11, it didn't much change the power dynamic in the house. Ida and Olive ruled the roost, and the men came and went, more as accessories or even obstructions than integral working parts. Secretly, though, Jean longed for her father. She watched with envy as her friends held their daddy's hands at the movie theater or rode on their shoulders at the county fair. She ached for him and wondered if he ached for her too. She knew that he wanted her. She knew it. After all, he had tried to kidnap her when she was just a baby. After more than 20 years of retellings, the story had become as much as part of the family lore as when Uncle Charlie got cut in half by a freight train. This is how the story goes. Ida was adding another bucket of coal to the stove in the living room when she heard the front door creak open. Without looking up, she spit. "It's about time you got home, Olive. Watch out for Jean there. She's playing blocks by the press." Ida went back to tending the coal fire, expecting her trollop daughter to once again creep in hours after her shift at the glass house had ended. Just as she finished adjusting the damper on that old piece of shit stove, Ida's heart felt like it was going to climb out of her chest and run right down Poplar Avenue. Something was wrong. She straightened her back quickly and turned in time to see not her auburn-haired daughter, but a gloved hand dragging little Jean by her dress tail, the black leather standing out in high relief against the pink muslin cloth. "George!" Ida screamed. "Get your gun, George! Get your gun!" She dropped the iron poker still gripped in her hand and raced the 20 or so feet to the doorway and scooped Jean up in her arms. Alarmed by her grandmother's frantic behavior, the toddler wailed and thrashed her head, blocking Ida's view of the interloper. Just then, George barreled from the kitchen and the living room, wielding his rabbit gun, screaming, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" Ida pointed towards the half-open door, and within seconds, George had kicked it wide, the brass doorknob splintering the wall, sending shards of horsehair plaster raining onto the wood floor. In a fluid motion that had become as natural to him as stretching before climbing out of bed, he raised the gun barrel until it was level with his eye, pressed the butt into the right shoulder joint, and fired it into the blue dusk. The shot echoed through the silence of the coming night. Just as the sound faded, Rod Kimberly's front window crashed open, followed by a shout. "You okay over there, Gould? Is little George at it again?" George Sr. lowered the barrel and peered out onto the snow-covered streets, his eyes dilating and contracting, trying to adjust to the almost darkness. "George!" Kimberly called out again, his voice pitched with urgency. George took a step towards the porch, and Ida pulled on the back of his white undershirt with her free hand while bouncing a still frightened Jean on her left hip. "Don't do it, George. Don't go after him. You don't know what they want. What if they have a gun, too? Don't do it." George looked back at Ida and Jean, whose red face was streaked with tears, and suddenly relaxed on his shoulders. "No worries, Rod," he yelled. "I was just shooting at that damn raccoon that keeps trying to get under the front porch." "Well, good God, Gould, you'd better take it easy with firing that gun at this time of the evening." Kimberly's round form lingered in the window for a few seconds, waiting for an answer, and then lowered the wooden frame, guarding his family against the cold. George heard other doors and windows up and down the avenue close one by one. As the last of his audience went back to their after-supper Jell-O parfaits and filterless smokes, he looked one more time for the unseen intruder, searching for movement in the now inky blackness. Finding no one, he shifted his gun, mindful of the still hot barrel, and shut the door, frowning at the circle of crumbled plaster. Ida studied her husband, watching for any sign that he too had suspected the identity of the intruder. He met her eyes as he crept by, tired from the excitement. He murmured, "You can't know for sure, Ida Whipkey Gould. You can't know for sure." Jean, who had grown quiet, all but an occasional chest-heaving sniffle, put her head down on her grandmother's apron-clad shoulder. Ida steeled her gaze, her gritting teeth forcing her mouth into a sour smirk as George continued walking towards the kitchen to clean the gun and put it back in the bedroom corner by the chifforobe. Ida didn't much care what that old man thought. She knew it was Jean's dad coming to get her. He was coming to take her away. Who else could it have been? Who else would kidnap a 2-year-old girl? The man Ida believed to be Jean's father lived in New York City. If he had managed to secret her out the door, they might never have seen Jean again. It had to be him, she screamed inside her head. It had to be him. Ida made a bed for Jean in her room that night, a pulled-out drawer from the oak dresser. She realized that she could never prove it, but she was as sure as she was about the feel of an undercooked dumpling that the would-be kidnapper was Jean's flesh and blood, come to haul her off to a place far away from Moundsville, West Virginia. The next morning, when George surveyed the ground, now sparkling under sunlight, he found a set of bloody footsteps leading away from his front porch and to the corner, where the owner of those prints must have climbed into his running vehicle and drove away. He carefully swept the bloody tracks into the shoveled snow mounds that banked the sidewalks. Thank God, George had chased him away before he could finish the job. Why wouldn't her dad want her? Ida affirmed her assumption. Every little girl needs their dad. All her life, Jean was told that the gloved man had been her father, coming to take her away. And she had spent most of her childhood simultaneously wishing he had and feeling grateful that he hadn't. By the time she was a teenager, she had become obsessed with finding the man with a New York accent who had gotten her mother pregnant and then abandoned her. But her quest had gotten her nowhere but a heart full of sorrow and the ire of just about everyone who loved her. And yet Jean refused to give up. She was certain that she would find him one day. What she hadn't considered is whether he wanted to be found.